My background is in immigration law, the movement of people, and human rights violations. I spent a significant portion of my career in the parts of the former Immigration and Naturalization Service and the Department of Homeland Security that finds and deports terrorists, organized crime entities, human rights abusers, things of that nature. So a lot of my work involved liaison with the Justice Department, actually representing the government in removal proceedings, deportation against people who were human rights violators and things of that nature. I now work at a think tank that deals with the connections between immigration, public safety, national security, and terrorism, the economy, all of the sort of intersections between immigration and other things. So I'm here to talk specifically about genocide, how it happens, why it's a concern in the Intermarium, and what we can possibly do to prevent it. So when Dr. Kosciuszko asked me to do this, I thought, this is fantastic, it's a great issue. Then I started doing research and said to myself, how am I going to do this in 40 minutes or less? Because it deals with a number of extremely complicated things. So I'm going to keep this at the kind of 10,000 foot altitude, because you can get very lost in numbers and statistics and sort of sociological analysis that doesn't make any sense. And I think the issues really are a lot simpler than that. So why are we talking about this in the first place? Well, during the Second World War, and to a certain extent during the First World War, the Intermarium was the site of multiple and horrifying incidences of mass murder. You had ethnic irredentist movements that were trying to capitalize upon the disorder caused by war in order to restore their version of a golden age that probably never existed in the first place. You had the emergence of communism, and you had the communists in conflict with everyone. With the advent of the Second World War, you had the Nazis in conflict with the communists and in conflict with everyone else. You had problems with anti-Semitism, and I think the nice, neat way to put it was, as Professor Kosciuszko has characterized it, the whole area was squeezed between the two major totalitarianisms, which were communism and Nazism. And you had a lot of people who were dislocated or forced out of previous positions of either power or lack of power that were capitalizing upon the whole situation in order to gain political power. And that, of course, led to a very sort of primitivistic thing that happens when you have big vacuums of power and you have giant powers contesting. People get angry, and they figure that the easiest solution is to get rid of the people who are standing in the way of whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. It's very human. Once upon a time, it was the accepted way of doing war. If you think about a lot of the conflict at the time of the Roman Empire and before that, you didn't want to beat your enemy and sign a treaty. You wanted to beat your enemy and keep him from sneaking into your village and stealing your women and your food at night. And the easiest way to do that was to just simply get rid of him. Now things evolved, and theoretically we got a lot nicer, but that's not necessarily the case. The numbers, when you look at any kind of accusation of genocide anywhere, tend to be all over the map, because people have a vested interest, as with the Katyn massacre, if you're on one side or another of these issues, to sort of make it appear that more or less people were killed. But according to R.J. Rummel, political scientist who studies these issues, during the World War II period, you had around 20,946,000 people murdered by the Nazi genocide state. A significant portion of that activity took place in the states of the Intermarium region. The Soviet Gulag state, you had about 61 million, and a very high percentage of people that were killed by the advancing and increasing Soviet Empire were people who were in places not in the Soviet Union, but in states that the Soviet Union was trying to overtake. You had about 1.5 million people murdered in what he characterizes as Poland's ethnic cleansing. I think that's really an inappropriate term. What he's talking about is people who were jockeying based from different political perspectives for control of contested territories that had bounced back and forth frequently, typically in border areas. And you had another roughly 1,100,000 people who were murdered in Tito's slaughterhouse. Now, if we look at the current conditions, in many ways they're similar to the precursor conditions that we saw prior to the Second World War. And those were the conditions that sort of led to multiple groups attempting to exterminate each other during the period leading up to World War II and throughout the end of it, and then through an extended period as the communist forces coming out of Russia tried to move into the area and consolidate their power. So I think if we take a look at this in context, there's reason to be concerned. There's not necessarily reason to panic yet, but I think in order to understand why we should be concerned, we have to first look at what is a genocide and why does it occur. So the term genocide, as one of the previous speakers mentioned, came to us from a Polish international legal scholar by the name of Raphael Lemkin. And he defined that as a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. Now, the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide adopted his definition with some additions to cover specific circumstances, but it basically surrounds his definition. R.J. Rummel, who I mentioned earlier, came up with a definition called democide because he believed that genocide didn't adequately cover the things that governments do when they're involved in mass murder. He defined democide as the murder of any person or people by their government, including genocide, politicide, and mass murder. All that's hair-splitting. The terminology really means very little. It's all one version or another of mass murder that's undertaken for political control. Now, why did genocide happen? Why do people engage in mass murder? There's a lot of conventional wisdom on this, and a lot of what passes for scholarship, and most of it's just ridiculous. It's jargon-laden. It gets into all kinds of absurd sociological theories about in-groups and out-groups, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I disagree with the conventional wisdom, and I think it's pretty straightforward. So the first part of it is self-evident. You tend to get genocides in situations where there is either war or economic crisis. Now, I say that's self-evident because usually happy people that have enough to eat and aren't in conflict with anyone don't just decide to go kill their neighbors en masse. There are some situations in history where things similar to that have happened, but they were usually the result of other external factors. So I think if you take a look at the literature and you take a look at the way genocide happens, they're actually a feature of violent revolution. Now, maybe a revolution that happens opportunistically when war breaks out, or it may happen as a response to perceived political or ethnic oppression. And I think there's one specific cause that's sort of underrated in all of the literature. It's the development of what's referred to as a mass movement. And mass movements tend to be dedicated to social, political, or religious change. There's kind of a loose theory that's starting to emerge in the literature that goes back to a French pioneer of psychology and sociology named Gustave Le Bon, who wrote a book called The Psychology of Socialism. Bertrand de Jouvenel, another Frenchman who was a philosopher, wrote a book called Power, which was about how and why people seize political power and how they keep it. And he focused on envy as the primary driver. But the most interesting take on the whole thing comes from an individual who is known as the hobo philosopher. His name was Erich Hoffer. He was an individual who he was an autodidact, he had no formal education, and he was an individual who wrote a couple of books that became popular in the 1960s, and recently in the context of studying how and why terrorism develops, he's become more popular. And his most significant book was called True Believer, and it was an examination of mass movements and how they form. And he provides an interesting sketch of, for lack of a better term, how things kind of go to hell in a handbasket in bad political situations and mass movements develop. Now, he said mass movements begin when discontented, frustrated, powerless people lose faith in existing institutions and demand change. Now, it's important to note that powerlessness is not a reference to poverty. One of his main points was that the destitute are not usually converts to mass movements, because they're too busy trying to survive to become engaged in politics. Rather, the converts tend to come from the new poor, who are people who previously had wealth or status, but who believe they've now lost it, because many such people are resentful and blame others for their problems. He also mentions that it can occasionally come from the people who are not newly wealthy, but have become newly elevated from poverty into a level just below the middle class, because they're now in a position to realize not what they have, but what they don't have. The other thing that he mentioned, which was interesting, is that mass movements also tend to attract what he calls a partially assimilated and outcasts. Now, when I was working for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, I spent 5 years working inside a maximum security prison in upstate New York. And we used to find people who were not US citizens and get a deportation order against them before they were released from prison. Now, until you've either worked in law enforcement or corrections, you have no idea how many maladjusted people there are in the world who will kill you at the drop of a hat just because. It may be to take your shoes, it may be because you have food when they need it, it may be because they just don't like the way you look or think. And those people tend to see an opportunity, whether it be for adventure, excitement, or acceptance, to emerge in situations where the bounds of society break down. And so very frequently you have, and I think this is throughout the history of communism and Nazism is very evident, you have a lot of people who are thugs who rise to positions of political prominence. Now, there's a common thread here. People who are likely to either believe they have an excuse for violating moral norms, or people who may have an innate antipathy toward moral norms to begin with, start to come into positions where they can exert power over society in a way that they never could before. You also have the larger group of people who may feel hopeless, and they want to participate in some kind of a movement that allows them to become part of a larger collective. And those are the two groups of people that tend to become the believers in a mass movement. And as Hofer put it, it's a movement that appeals not to those intent on bolstering and advancing a cherished self, but those who crave to be rid of an unwanted self because it can satisfy the passion for self-renunciation. So faith in a holy cause then becomes a substitute for the loss of faith in oneself. And what you have is when you become focused on the holy cause, mass movements are then able to demand of their followers a total surrender of the distinct self. Therefore, a follower identifies as a member of a certain tribe or family that becomes greater than the individual himself or herself. And you couple that with the fact that mass movements tend to denigrate and loathe the present. There's something wrong with the present. We were part of the group that God ordained as the people in charge. We're the master race. We figured out the iron laws of history, however you want to put it. But there is a dissatisfaction with the present that is replaced by a utopian future. So by regarding the modern world as worthless, the movement inspires a battle against it. Problem with that is, you can't kill off the idea of the present, but you can kill off the people in the present and the way in which they interact with each other. So part of what happens in situations leading up to genocide is people become dislocated from the cultural and legal and political institutions that allow them to function together. If you stop and think about it, all the regulations and all the rules and laws and the customs and everything that we follow are really a social lubricant. They allow huge numbers of people living in a crowded place with crazy drivers to be able to get through the average everyday tasks of life without killing each other. When you take the governor off, and you're all of a sudden in a situation where those social constrictions no longer apply, it becomes very easy to find it legitimate or even praiseworthy to eliminate all of the people who are keeping you from achieving your utopian vision. So mass movements, one of the things that keeps them together is you must always have an object of hate, which unifies believers against an other, who is also the scapegoat for whatever the problem is that has made them dissatisfied with the modern world. And the ideal devil is a foreigner. And here, foreigner doesn't refer to someone who's a citizen of a different republic. It refers to someone who is from a different ethnic, tribal, religious, or political group. Now, Hofer, who appears to have had some innate mistrust of organized religion, was loath to characterize mass movements as either good or evil, and he appears to have considered Christianity a mass movement. I think that was a mistake, and I think there's a major distinction between a mass movement and the development of a moral system that appeals to large numbers of people. And that distinction rests in the fact that mass movements require the surrender of the self to a greater cause but not a higher power. Now, moral codes, whether they come in the form of religion or some other type of higher power moral code, emphasize the importance of the individual and the individual's obligations both to whatever the higher power is and to each other. And that makes a big difference because self-sacrifice becomes important in that context only when it benefits one's fellow man, and it keeps people from becoming a disposable attribute that can be used simply to further a political cause. So, how does that all apply to what's going on in the Intermarium region today? We have a region that sits squarely within what Halford Mackinder, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Mackinder, but Mackinder was a geographer at Oxford University who divided the world into two parts. He said the world consisted of the world island and the periphery. And he said that the world island had a particular area, which essentially is the Eurasian steppes, and he believed that whoever controlled the geographical pivot of history, as he called it, controlled the world island and therefore controlled the world. Now, if you look at the Intermarium on a map, it's the gatehouse guarding the approaches to the geographical pivot of history. It's the way into the Russian steppes. It's the overland gateway to the east for Western powers. It also happens to be the gateway to the west for Eastern powers. It's largely the borderline between Eastern and Western thought in Europe. And it also happens to be a very resource-rich area. And then there's a sort of new wrinkle in all of this. And this is part of why there is a concern about the potential for genocide in the future. There's a significant long-standing population of Muslim residents from Croatia all the way into the Central Asian states like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It also happens to be a short hop from the Intermarium region to the preferred overland routes out of the Middle East. Now, people currently fleeing conflict in the war-torn Fertile Crescent area and beyond tend to use two major land routes into Europe. One of them goes from Turkey to Bulgaria and then into Romania or Albania. The other one goes from Azerbaijan to Russia into Moldova or the Ukraine. You also have a way in through Croatia, which sits on the Mediterranean seaborne route and is a country that has a small but significant and politically active Muslim population, and it sits right on the edge of the Intermarium region. Now, you have that pressing across Europe towards the Intermarium from one direction. In the other direction from the east, you have a resurgent Russia, which has largely become revanchist, and it's busy re-annexing or planning to re-annex territory that used to be part of the Soviet Union. Part of that is to shift focus away from problems that Russia is having internally, and part of it is, I think, it currently has a leader and a large group of political leaders who just really think that the Soviet Union having an empire was a better way for Russia overall. On top of that, you have the fact that communism in Russia is morphing, and what you're starting to get is a new brand of Russian thought that kind of looks like a hybrid between German-style National Socialism and Russian-style International Socialism. Now, in many ways, you can say that Nazism was just a form of socialism that focused on the folk rather than the proletariat, and it's entirely likely that politically and economically disgruntled Russians could become the next equivalent to the Nazi Party. This is something that's frightening, it's something that people kind of laugh at, but if you pay attention to what's going on with the rise of a Russian neo-Nazi party and parties with similar ideas that are not being oppressed or shut down by the Russian government, but in many ways courted, it's something that's a very realistic threat. And then we take a look at Crimea, and we have to wonder who's next. Will it be Belarus? Will it be the Central Asian states? Will it be Romania and Moldova? Then if you look eastward in the other segment of the East, and look at the Middle East, you have a complete disintegration there. There's a power vacuum that was left, with Iraq no longer being a Ba'athist Iraq, Iran trying to exert its influence all over the place, Russia starting to come up with a new Middle East policy and reach out to the Middle East rather than simply focusing on the near abroad, and you have the complete total mess that's Syria, which no one knows what's going to happen there. And then the final really kind of linchpin in all of this is you have pressure from a creaking European Union, which is trying to stay afloat as people start to question what it actually does, why it costs as much as it does, and how national sovereignty fits into the European Union. And the European Union, quite frankly now, is attempting to coerce Poland and Hungary to accept refugees that they don't want, and who, quite frankly, show no signs of being able to assimilate to Western mores. And this is particularly important in Poland and Hungary because Poland and Hungary are both at a point where they've finally achieved a stable footing and eradicated most of the harmful vestiges of communist rule. And they've also firmly planted their feet in the camp of the rule of law and order, and particularly the rule of law as based on a Christian understanding of the world, which is significant. In the United States, we sort of politically have a very contentious relationship with religion, largely because we have never defined what a religion is, which means that federal judges dealing with religious cases are nearly free to call anything they want a religion. But I think it's important that Poland and Hungary have opposed themselves to the sort of secular European Union, which has a very hostile relationship toward Christianity and, based on a lot of New Agey Frankfurt School kind of thought, believes that Christianity is actually responsible for a lot of the problems that Europe has experienced. So I want to take a look at a scenario, and this may sound a little far-fetched, but I think if you stop and look at it, it shows just how easily all of this could happen, and you could have a situation of political collapse emerge. So let's assume, a mere 7 years in the future, it's 2025, excuse me. And let's take a look at a couple of things that realistically could happen, and this is stuff I've pulled from the news. I wanted to write something that was kind of a little more Jason Bourne and exciting and had some details to it. When I started looking at how to do it, I thought it's really frightening how close the edge we can be at times and how simple it is for things to fall apart if those of us who have certain beliefs about the validity of Western Judeo-Christian tradition are afraid to stand up for that. So the president was on the news last week talking about wanting to withdraw troops from Syria because the U.S. has been involved too long and it's too expensive. Of course, she's not taking into account what the situation could become in Syria if there is no presence from the U.S. in Western Europe. He's also talking about reducing the numbers of people in Iraq and Afghanistan. So let's say the U.S. becomes more isolationist. It pulls out of the Middle East. As a result, the Middle East starts to collapse even more so than it currently has and degenerate into tribal warfare. Well, that inevitably will trigger a new flow of refugees into Europe. Now, Belgium is already teetering on becoming the first Muslim majority country in Europe. And that's particularly problematic because while Belgium is a small country, being the seat of much of the European government and being the traditional strategic position that it has been, it exerts influence all out of proportion to its size and power. If that were to happen, then it's very likely that France, Germany, and Italy, who are already overwhelmed with refugees from the Middle East and have done virtually nothing to try and deal with that problem, come up with an assimilationist plan and manage the flow, they're very likely to find themselves unable in a face of a new flow of refugees to be able to stop bringing them. Part of that has to do with the fact that over recent years when there have been flows of refugees, they've been given asylum and they've become French citizens. So they're now becoming a major voting bloc with political power who can actually exert an influence on the French policy of how many refugees they're going to take. The same thing is happening in Germany and to a lesser extent in Italy. What's going to be the result of that? Well, the inevitable result of that is that the EU is really going to begin putting it on Poland and Hungary to accept Muslim, South Asian, and African refugees. And Poland and Hungary have both been very staunch in resisting that effort, and I can't see, A, why they would want to change their position, or B, why they should. Well, that brings up some interesting strategic possibilities. Now, Russia has sort of behaved itself in this regard for a while, but if you think back to particularly Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, one of the major reasons for Russia becoming expansionist into the Balkans prior to the First World War was the claim that it needed to protect its Slavic little brother, or little brothers, plural. Now, they kind of backed off of that whole narrative because it didn't work so well and it was pretty obvious that they were interested in other things. However, if you look at Russia and its policy options, it's very creative in the sense of being devious and underhanded, but it's not very creative in the sense of it doesn't come up with new approaches to things. It simply recycles the old ones, sometimes because they're effective, sometimes because the Russian government tends to be hogtied by communism, tradition, lack of new approaches being injected into the way they do business. So it's entirely possible that if Russia sees a kind of Muslim horde pushing through the Intermarium, it's going to want to protect supposedly Orthodox Christianity, Slavic culture, and want to attend to the needs of its Slavic little brothers, just as it did prior to World War I, which means the possibility of Russia moving into places where it probably shouldn't be operating once again, annexing territory, possibly annexing whole countries again. So in that situation, the Intermarium once again would find itself squeezed between two totalitarianisms. One, a newly arrived fundamentalist Muslim Europe, or at least a very large political bloc voting that way in Europe, and then a new version of the Soviet Union pushing from the other direction. Now, is that instantly going to cause the region to degenerate into a sort of genocidal madness? No, but the fact is you now have two political factors pushing from either direction, beginning to start the kind of degradation of social, cultural, political, and legal institutions within society that keep order and that allow countries to be able to push back against those threats. So what can be done? Well, that's the important question. Now, I think the first and most important thing is to acknowledge that despite Raphael Lemkin's best intentions, law is utterly useless for preventing genocide. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, law only works when there is a deterrent effect. If you have a country that's fallen apart and the deterrent effect is not of significance anymore, then people simply aren't going to obey the law when it's not in their interest to do so. The other problem is that the concept of international law is wonderful when you're talking about states that have been committed to the rule of law and have good relationships with each other. So commercial disputes, territory disputes between places like France, England, Germany, so on and so forth, can be settled in an international legal tribunal. But the fact is, once everything falls apart and you have states that are adversaries to each other, there is no arbiter above a sovereign state with the power to force them to do anything that they don't want to do. Now, in the cases of smaller states, larger states, if they want to become involved, can bring power to bear, but you're out of the legal realm at that point. And I think it's interesting, Cicero said, inter arma silent leges, which means in time of war, law is silent. Ada Bozeman, who held multiple degrees in international law and wrote a book called The Future of Law in a Multicultural World, believed firmly that law is a function of morality. Morality, in turn, is a function of culture, and law translates poorly across vast cultural gulfs. Therefore, international law simply isn't a workable construct. So what are the solutions? Well, they're actually simpler than they would seem to be upon first glance. The first thing is we need to prop up Western culture. The adversaries that we're dealing against, despite evidence that it does not work and will never work, are not afraid to push communism. You're talking about an adversary coming from the Middle East who believes, with faith, that their approach is the correct approach, regardless of what the consequences are. A secular Western civilization with no muscular morality drawn from Christianity can never hope to push back against that. If you have a secular moral compass, it always points back to yourself, and you find yourself in a position where there aren't any transcendent guiding principles anymore. We need to restore morality in general to the public square, because when people see their neighbors as people to whom they have obligations, in the face of other political pressure, it becomes much harder to kill them. Generally speaking, most of us sitting in this room don't want to eliminate the people sitting next to us or living next to us. Well, why? Because we live in a country where the dominant theory is that we are all fellow citizens, we have an obligation to stand up for each other, and we're a community. It may be a very large community, but nonetheless, it's a community. I think it's also important to re-energize NATO. There's been a lot of talk about how valuable NATO is, but I think NATO is sort of the glue that held the Western world together after the tragedy of World War II. It still serves that function, and it's important that it continue to serve that function. I also think we need to accept that we are in a class of civilizations and we need to begin acting accordingly. We need to begin exercising Western might before we lose it, and with it, lose all the things that have made Western culture predominant in the world. And now when I say Western might, I'm not talking about military power dropping bombs on people's heads, but rather the power of knowledge that we have that flows directly from the Judeo-Christian moral and intellectual tradition. I think in the end, it's probably going to be Levi's, Nike sneakers, flush toilets, Carrier climate control, Ford trucks, and things of that nature that convince the people who would want to eliminate us that, well, gee, maybe these people aren't so bad. You know, I would think if you're living in the middle of the desert in Yemen or Iraq or someplace, and all of a sudden a country like Poland or the United States or France brings you water and air conditioning, you have to be thinking, well, you know, the imams and the mullahs and whoever may be telling me that these people aren't so great, but I'm still drinking the water that they put in. And we have sort of lost that approach to public diplomacy. So in the end, I think Hofer and Juvenal's concept of envy as the driver of all politics is something that we have tended to look at as a negative in a crisis. But really what it is, it's the fulcrum that we can turn on our adversaries and begin to change their way of thinking without them ever comprehending that they're being transformed. So thank you.